folks joining us now. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us, and really appreciate you being here to have this important conversation as we have like the nicest day that we've had in a long time. So appreciate everybody being here to do this, and we'll have a really good conversation, and then everybody can get outside and get some fresh air, hopefully. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation because this is obviously we're in a really deep crisis. Our students and families are being impacted in ways that deepen all the inequities that we all know about and have fought so hard on over the years. And so it's really an important time, I think, for the stakeholders who are most connected to our students and families to be leading the fight and leading the charge on the ideas that we really need to make sure that the solutions to this problem are equitable. And so to me, it was really important to make sure that the teachers had an opportunity as this conversation began about how we might come out of this and what recovery is going to look like and what a reopening might look like, to make sure that teacher ideas were really front and center in that conversation. And so maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we put out to EmpowerEd's Teacher Council, which is a really diverse group of both DCPS and charter school teachers, a invitation to give us feedback. We did an initial survey on the idea of teacher looping as a strategy that some people had been talking about to provide continuity. And as we started to get more feedback from teachers about what we wanted the next phases to look like, we asked our teacher council to dive into a lot more detail about what have we learned from this crisis, and then what immediate steps do we need to take, and what does a recovery look like? So as people began to contribute those ideas, it started building into a lot of substance, and we decided to put it into this education recovery plan. And so we hope this is a really comprehensive guide for folks who are considering what a recovery is going to look like, and on what schedule we can do it, and how it's going to happen, and how it's going to impact everybody, to think about this as our teachers do. And so we're just going to take the next 20-25 minutes or so to kind of run through this a little bit and some of the major highlights, and then have a conversation about it. The goal is that it's really a living document. Even after we put it out Monday, we've continued to make notes and amendments and changes to it as people have contributed new great ideas. And so we want to continue that, and hopefully as a result of this conversation, we'll keep updating this plan. We know that the Mayor's Committee on Reopening for Education and Childcare didn't have a teacher voice initially on it, but we're really excited and proud that this plan was part of the required reading that they gave out to the group. And that they're taking these ideas into consideration. So we want to give them another source of information here, and hear directly from teachers, not just what's in the plan, but also what is it looking like for you to actually do this distance learning and virtual learning? What are your hopes and fears for what happens after this? So we'll start then with just kind of the introduction to this, and I'm going to turn it over to the writer of the preface of the report, Elizabeth Koenig, to walk us through what we've learned from the COVID crisis.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Koenig. I'm a pre-K teacher at LaSalle Backus Education Campus. And I'm not going to read from the document. You can do that if you want to, because it's all written there. But I think it's my role to just kind of set the tone here and the lay of the land. And I was just thinking about, what we're feeling about our schools right now as teachers. And I think for a lot of educators, we're feeling grief. And I think our schools have been defined in whole new ways by this health emergency, and kind of defined by what we lost when they closed. Some of the things we've lost are touch, community, connection, joy, and definitely learning. Distance learning has exacerbated the gaps that we've all talked about for so long. A family's socioeconomic status is affecting the quality of their education that they're receiving, whether it's due to lack of access to food, internet, job security, or community networks, or government support, such as unemployment. One of the functions of our schools, whether you think it should be or not, is to attempt to buffer the difficulties caused by our inequitable society, the unequal access to power and resources. But now schools and teachers have lost many of the tools we had to help with that. Relationship building, observation, play, connection, holistic support. And so then the differences between the families' access to education deepens in this period of distance learning. A student whose family struggled with food security and internet access before the crisis could be given extra meals to take home in their backpack and access to a computer lab or a library next door to do their schoolwork. And now some families are unreachable and we can't even find them. And the provision of food or devices requires a coordinated and complicated effort. So of course, as teachers, we've been helping each other, sharing resources, trying to reach all our families, and developing this plan. And what we've really come up with, we've been feeling this grief and everyone's been feeling it in different ways. When we do return to school, we want the focus to be on social emotional support, healing from trauma, and the reforging of communities, not on testing and adherence to strict curricular objectives. We'll need more investment in mental health staff and supports for both students and educators. If this sounds a little like what we've been asking for even before the crisis, you're right. We needed it then, and we're going to need it even more now. We can't rush back to how school was before, and we don't want to in a lot of ways. So we're here to think creatively to make the return to school safe, equitable, and good for everyone involved, students, families, and teachers. We're willing to try schedules we've never tried, teach in ways we've never been taught to ourselves, and take calculated risks in order to teach our students. In return, we ask for our voices to be listened to and our input to be valued. We've done what we could in the era of unexpected emergency distance learning, but we're frustrated by its limits. It's just not the teaching as we know it. Distance learning is and always will be a poor substitute for the glorious educational chaos of a school building. But we're here to try to think together about what that's going to look like when we do go back. So now I'm going to turn it over to Isa to talk more about that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isa, and I'm going to start by talking about immediate next steps that we as educators think are the things that need to be done right now to support our families in the district. And the two main things that are really immediate are closing the digital divide, which we're all very much aware of, and also supporting families with food and meal distribution through the summer. And so we know that the digital divide is essentially a matter of equity, and the city should continue to do the device distribution that they've already started to do, but also really focus on overseeing that device distribution, not just as a DCPS LEA, but also our charter LEAs. So there are many charter schools that are stepping up to the cause and doing some really innovative things to get technology to students. But this isn't across the board. Some schools are falling short, and district officials need to oversee these schools' distribution processes and really elevate the lessons that we can learn from the schools that are doing it really well, and sort of disseminate those best practices to the schools that still need to, that this is an area of growth for. In addition, they should reach out, our LEAs, DCPS, and charter LEAs should reach out to DC businesses like law practices and major firms that are really just looking for ways to give back, and then may have a lot of old technology laptops that they can distribute. This is also a great opportunity to really develop a family digital inventory, but one that is really robust in the sense that we want to know exactly how many devices are in a home and how many people there are in a home. I've had students who are telling me, yes, we have a laptop, but then once distance learning started, we realized that the laptop is the laptop that the parent is using for work all day while they're working from home. And so the student didn't actually have access to the internet during the school day, which meant that just explained why they weren't able to participate as much. And so having this robust digital inventory will really let us know if families have a device per student. In addition, we've noticed, and I'm sure all educators have noticed, that access to a device was just one part of the struggle. Access to internet was an even harder struggle to get over, and we're still dealing with that now. My school today was distributing hotspots yesterday and today, but they should continue to do that to make sure that every family has what they need to be able to access distance learning. And I am really excited that they got it at this point, but I also just would like to point out that we're 6 weeks into distance learning, and at this point we have 4 weeks left. And so just the foresight of being able to have this inventory will help us in the future. And finally, making sure that these inventories live centrally so that the DCPS and PCSB can really have like a centralized way of organizing this information and then having a centralized way to distribute these devices. In terms of meal and food distribution, we know that the effects of COVID-19 and the economic effects especially are going to last a lot longer than the crisis itself. And so even if we do get to a place where families are able to go back to work or where families are able to find jobs again, we know that the economic devastation to families is really great. And so there will be families that are still going to continue to need meal support, and particularly through the summer when the school year ends. That's just a time that, you know, a lot of families have reached out asking, like, is food distribution going to continue happening over the summer? And I'd love to be able to give these families an answer. In addition, it would be useful to sort of shift to the groceries instead of like the daily meals. That'll free up meal sites capacities to meet the demand that they have, but also just give families that ability to, you know, not have to go out every day to get a meal for each kid, but just be able to go maybe once a week to pick up groceries that they can then use and cook in the home. And for the district to really set a schedule that clarifies where pickups may be done and whether or not you need to be a member of that school community to pick up at that site, just to make it extremely clear. And this is something that has already started, but that in the case that meal distribution continues, should also continue.
Awesome. Thanks, Isa. And so I just want to get into the principles here that we laid out for reopening. Obviously, all of this is contingent on making sure the health standards are in place, on the health experts really deciding that it's appropriate to go back in a physical sense in any way. But when we get to that point, there's a lot of things we need to have in place. First, on the health end, we have to make sure that there's sufficient testing to make sure that we can go back. A lot of our schools don't have full-time nurses. There's no way we're going to be able to go back without our schools all having a full-time nurse on board. We have to make sure there's a uniform approach to this. We can't have it be every school deciding on their own what the standard is in terms of if one person is infected, if a teacher is, if a student is, do we shut down a classroom? Do we shut down a school? We need an approach to that that's set ahead of time. And we need to make sure there's a plan in place to phase this back in a way that makes sense for everybody. But the overriding thing that I want to talk about in terms of the principles, because this is what we really heard from teachers in the survey in creating this document, was that we do not want to go back to school and be in a rush to let's just get back to drilling math, to drilling reading, to making up for the learning loss in a typical way, because people have gone through something. And there's a lot that we need to do to make sure that we rebuild the community after months apart. You know, I have a 3-year-old who didn't know her year was going to end, right? And all of a sudden is not going to be with her classmates again, or possibly with her first teacher again in a classroom. There's a lot that we need to do to kind of rebuild community when folks come back together. So what we heard from so many of the teachers there was, let's prioritize the social emotional support. Let's prioritize thinking about that trauma. And I also want to call out prioritizing a holistic curriculum, right? So making sure that it's, that, you know, people need arts, people need electives, people need the physical activity in their day. We've got to make sure we're not just focusing on the testing subjects as we do sometimes. And people really need the civics. You know, we're going through a historic moment together. There's rich lessons to be learned from what we're going through together. So I think for people to be able to get the social studies experience of learning about this historic moment, to thinking about their role in it as a citizen, as a potential voter, and all of those things is really important. So thinking about what we get holistically. You know, we talked about having some role for teacher looping, and we'll talk about that a little more later with some experience, but we want to make sure that there's some continuity for our students when they come back. We know that there's a lot of vulnerable populations, even you know, with our students and families, and also with our educators. So we have to make sure that we're not penalizing anyone who's not able to come back physically if we are able to do that. And so those are just kind of some general principles we've laid out. It's in more detail in the plan. But since Liz Rosenberg isn't on yet, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the options for future distance learning and extended school, and then turn it over to Christian. So, you know, when we come back, there's a lot of possibilities, and we're finally getting folks thinking about this. One of the concerns is that we haven't seen a lot of principals, school leaders, teachers, and students engaged in the thinking about what a new setup would look like. So if we have some mix between a physical environment and a virtual environment, who is going to be involved in what stages? Do we stagger the start times? You know, one of the things we've suggested is figuring out a way to reduce caseloads. People have talked about for a long time, students, that, you know, it might be beneficial for elementary, middle, and high school to start at a different time, because in ordinary circumstances, we have high school students who bring their younger siblings into school and aren't able to get to school on time. That's something that might make even more sense with the physical requirements that are going to be needed now. Do we have to keep kids in a single room throughout the day? And how are we going to do that, not just physically, but emotionally with our children? There are options like a 4x4 or another kind of block schedule for the upper grades, where, you know, teachers don't have 150 students at a time, but rather have a reduced caseload, so they can take fewer classes at a time and rotate through them, which might make some sense with physical distancing. But we do want to make sure that those early times when we come back is focused on students who really need the additional support, and is focused on social emotional support in a holistic curriculum. And one thing that's really important in that is making sure that we're focused on assessment, not for the purpose of evaluation, but for the purpose of getting a pulse on where our students are. So I'm going to turn it over to Christian to talk a little bit about testing.
Hey, y'all, my name is Christian. I teach 6th grade science at McFarland Middle School. When we talk about testing, our concerns really come from a concern around how time is being used. We understand that the most important and useful thing that our students can be doing, even during a normal school year, is being in classrooms with teachers, learning from them. And also keeping in mind that when we do start the next school year, however it looks, that the needs of our students won't be academic needs and any social emotional needs, anything else, won't be easily quantifiable. We won't be able to boil this down to a number. So keeping that in mind, even in a normal year, the amount of time that our students lose, instructional time that our students lose to testing, is astronomical, measuring in months, not weeks or days, but measured in months, especially when you factor in the amount of time used for park prep and things like that. And that's for an average student. Students who, ELL students who take time for WIDA, or students with IEPs who are taking time for additional inventories and things like that, lose even more instructional time. We recognize the need for assessment, but considering the time we've lost this year, that's not acceptable for next year. So what we would like to see is a greater emphasis on adaptive testing that meets students where they're at, and is a better measure of growth versus proficiency-based assessments such as PARC that measure students' progress against a fixed bar. Another benefit of adaptive testing, like MAP in particular, is that we can use that, teachers can use that information right away. There's not a big gap in time between when students take the test and when the results come back. So it's more immediately useful. We think there also should be designated time for students to complete the WIDA access test. They didn't get a chance to do that this year, obviously, and that's something that that schools need in order to determine placements and in order to plan interventions. Those numbers carry a lot of weight, and that's something that should be prioritized as soon as reasonably possible. Keeping everything in mind, we also really strongly believe that PARC should not be evaluative for anybody, for teachers or for principals, mainly because we just won't really have a full understanding of the impacts of this pandemic academically or emotionally on our students, and it's highly likely that this school year won't be a typical school year anyway. So PARC is not going to be an effective measure of teachers, principals, or what have you, and it shouldn't be used like that. More than anything, this is really an opportunity to really critically examine the way that assessment is used in DC. And and be creative and come up with some alternative solutions for a really complex problem, and potentially build some stronger structures, assessment programs moving forward. And we think that's something we should embrace and we should take advantage of as we think about how we're going to assess our students next year.
Thank you. And, you know, even as all the trauma that our students and our families are going through, we also know that this has been a really difficult time for educators as they take on that burden too and manage so many things in their own lives. And so I want to turn it over to Giselle to talk a little bit about educators' mental health. Giselle, are you with us?
Yes, sorry. I was trying to figure out how to work this thing. Hi, guys. Yeah, thank you, Scott. So Liz kind of touched on this with her introduction. So as educators, as we're going back into the building, potentially, we're not only bringing our own experiences, but we're bringing the experience of our students as well during this really trying and difficult time. You know, we often take on multiple roles as educators. We're social workers, we're mentors, we're advocates, we're community liaisons. And oftentimes there isn't a space for us to really be vulnerable, really express some of the struggles that we're having. And so one of the things that is important for us as we plan is making sure that educators, teachers, they are receiving not only the space, but the opportunity to address some of their own mental health issues. So one way that can look is instead of, or in addition to regular sick days and PTO days that are allocated for us, having additional mental health days, specifically for educators to use, and not being penalized, you know, if you do use one of those days or many of those days. Yeah, and also I think educators really need to be in a safe space, in a space that they can really develop emotional resilience, which is critical in the role that we play, not only for our students, their families, but I think more importantly for us, because when we are able to thrive as educators, as people, our students will also benefit and thrive. Thanks.
Thanks, Giselle. And so I want to talk about this idea of continuity of care, which is really important in so many ways because we all experienced this really abrupt ending without a closure to the current school year as we've transitioned. And so I want to ask Francesca Smith to talk a little bit about the idea of teacher looping, what she's experienced before, and why we've gotten a complicated picture of whether that might be a good response to this crisis.
Sure. So, hi, everyone. In prioritizing teacher mental health, like was just talked about, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing student mental health. And we think that teacher looping could be considered as a practice, especially for our younger students and our elementary students. Teacher looping would mean students returning in the fall with their same groups of teachers and students. And we're proposing this at least as a method for at least the beginning to close out with that same group if they do have to move on to a new teacher later on in the school year. As we've alluded to, we'd propose looping as a means of providing emotional security and continuity that students are going to be in such great need of when they return to their buildings. We believe that relationships and knowing students is key for not only making up the lost time academically and knowing where students are at, where they were at when we last saw them, but also for the emotional support that we can give more effectively by knowing students and what they acted like before and seeing differences in how we need to support them more when they return. It'd be especially helpful, of course, if we have to start online for any reason. Building relationships online would be much more challenging. And like Scott said, there are pros and cons that we want to be considered with this, and especially teachers' individual perspectives. There's the consideration of teachers being asked to teach new content, or like the teachers in 5th grade or pre-K3 and kindergarten, where they wouldn't have a group of returning students or would have to go to a very different grade level. So we want in schools considering this for teachers' opinions and interests to be taken into account, rather than as a blanket fix. And as someone who has looped with students from pre-K, between pre-K and kindergarten, I've seen what a head start, especially for the youngers, it can give you for knowing students and knowing their strengths and challenges. So I think it could be an effective way of supporting our kids in the fall.
Thanks, Francesca. And I want to talk a little bit about that continuity in terms of how it's going to happen with our teachers, with our principals, and our professional learning. So Ben Williams from Capital City Public Charter School will talk us through that part.
Sure, thanks, Scott. My name is Ben Williams. I'm a 12th grade U.S. government and DC history teacher at Capital City. Similar to what other people have talked about with, caring for educators and caring for our communities, we need to make sure that when we return to school, the same teachers or experienced teachers are still in our schools to be able to provide that continuity of care. So EmpowerEd and the state board throughout the last couple years have really spearheaded this work to illuminate the crisis of teacher turnover in the district, and understanding that we already have a rate of teacher turnover that's extraordinarily high. So there needs to be extra investment right now to make sure that when we return to school, we have, experienced teachers, and we have the teachers that kids can connect to and families know to be able to provide that supportive community. So one situation that I think we want to try and avoid is, what happened in the emergency after Hurricane Katrina, in which the school system there experienced a lot of experienced teachers, particularly teachers of color, who decided to leave the profession, retire early, and exacerbated a lot of the inequity, both in terms of social emotional learning and academic learning that children in New Orleans were facing. So to be able to make sure that we address those things, the work of the state board, along with EmpowerEd, has proposed some concrete things that really make sure that this issue gets attention. And so things can look a lot of different ways with making sure that teachers stay in the classroom, but a couple of the ideas that we've proposed include making sure that there's flexible scheduling or part-time scheduling for certain teachers, increasing teacher leadership programs. That's part of the reason we're having this call in the first place, is to make sure that teacher voice is at the table. And I think as we return to schools, we want to make sure that experienced educators are again at the table, and that we're avoiding top-down approaches that don't necessarily involve the leadership and expertise that we know that we as educators have possessed and can contribute to leading in our school communities. So one of those things, as Christian kind of said with accountability with testing, is we'd also like to see that same type of compassion applied towards teachers. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we can shift away from a lot of the punitive evaluation systems right now and make sure that there's peer-to-peer growth systems and supportive systems to help teachers adapt to these new circumstances. One of the ideas that EmpowerEd has really been focused on recently is the idea of floating professional development. Most of us on the call, in one way or another, and particularly classroom teachers, have been forced to adapt to distance learning in ways that we're learning new skills, learning new platforms, learning different ways to reach kids, academically and holistically. So as things continue to change and we figure out how to adapt to transitioning back, we also need to make sure that floating PD could be a way for teachers to continue spearheading our development in meeting the needs of kids in these kind of unprecedented or uncharted times, and that people can develop relationships authentically so that people who are doing things well can be partnered with teachers who need support to be able to make sure that we're minimizing gaps. The only other thing I'd like to say on the topic is that school leadership stability is also an important part, and that with a lot of change right now, it's not just teachers that we should be focusing on retaining, especially effective teachers, but for, good leaders and good principals, it's now also more important than ever that schools have consistency with the school leadership to be able to help guide them through. So pressures and extra stresses that we can take off of principals and assistant principals' plates, is also going to pay dividends in being able to create the type of learning environments that we want to cultivate coming back to school, whenever that is. So having said that, I think we're going to move into the Education Recovery Act. So I'll pass that over to Jamal to kind of help lead us through that.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. So, as you know, with our act, just in general, everyone is very confused or at least overwhelmed by the situation because it's not something anyone has ever dealt with before. And unfortunately, there have been some setbacks, there have been some drop balls, and all we can do really is just try and recover going forward. So with us, we're trying to address something in the inequities that are already pre-existing in DC, while also trying to address the more immediate concerns that have come from the COVID-19 crisis. And one of the big things that we have to talk about is funding. Now, I was actually at various hearings by the mayor regarding the DC funding, and we already know that the DC funding is rather tight when it comes to the budget for schools. Yes, granted, we did get an increase, but it hasn't closed the gaps between our more vulnerable populations, especially our at-risk students. So one of the big things that we would like to push for is actually see a stimulus for the schools. I'm not sure if anyone's been following Trayon's white critical at-risk document. He actually proposed it in June 25th under the title legislation number B230365. And this particular bill is more or less an expansion of the definition of at-risk students. So if you're not familiar with at-risk funding, the PAVE, Parents Amplifying Voices in Education, actually made a really excellent one-pager explaining the at-risk funding. What Trayon's is trying, or Mr. Councilmember White is trying to do, is actually expand the definition to include students that are at least within, or schools that have 70% of students at risk. This could be applied retroactively to try and support those students who are already behind in the gap, and also get them the support now that we're going to be returning back to school at some point in time. And it is something that is still being pushed through. So if you can, please continue to look into this policy. It is online. Again, it is the B230365 Critical Risk Rate School Funding Designation of 2019. It was recently reviewed on March, I believe, the 10th, and there's more information going on. Currently, it's still in hearing, but that information is all available. It is possibly one of the bigger things that we can push for and hope for in order to get these kids included. Because unfortunately, as I work in Ward 7 and 8, I always see the distance between where the kids' needs are actually being met in schools and where they're actually performing. And that challenge can only be addressed if we actually get more supports for those schools that are serving a larger population in that range. So for that, I believe I'd like to pass on to Liz once again to talk more about the emergency that is with the younger kids.
Yeah, just also the coming emergency with childcare. So, childcare centers, a lot of them have had to close. And there's a new analysis out by the Center for American Progress that estimates a full 20% of daycare providers in DC could be out of business permanently, with a loss of 6,596 childcare seats. And if you've ever tried to get a kid into childcare in DC, it's already been a very stressful, costly endeavor. So now that we have fewer seats, or now that we may have fewer seats, what are we going to do, especially when teachers are some of the ones needing those seats to be able to return to schools? And again, we have to think about the which parts of our city are going to be losing the most childcare seats, and will the impact be greater on different populations? How can we protect the families that will be most disrupted, whose education will be most disrupted by lack of childcare? This study that I'll put the link in the chat to is recommending at least $50 billion in federal aid from the federal government to childcare businesses across the country, and that it will absolutely be necessary if we want to meet the need for childcare to have this all work at a statewide level or a DC level. We could rethink subsidies, give them to essential workers, including teachers, and try and create a registry of childcare centers that are available to stay open in case of emergency. And yeah.
Thanks. Briefly, I just want to touch on adult education, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chanel and Colin to talk a little bit finally about social emotional support before we open it up. So one thing we want to talk about is the gap. One of the gaps that we've seen is the gap in adult education and how important that gap is to our students. In addition to the digital divide, their parents actually being able to help them with schoolwork, and not only whether they're essential workers, whether they need to be working outside the home, whether there's enough devices to go around to be able to help them, but whether they're actually able to provide that help with their own education. And so one of the things we mentioned in here is, DCPS is doing this Parent University, a YouTube channel to provide help on selected topics. But we could really have a much more systemic approach to doing adult education. We see funds adult education much higher than many places in the country, but there's a lot of progress to be made in terms of how we address that. And this is really a moment to see its importance. I spent some time as working in adult education in Mexico, where they have a really systemic approach to adult education, where there are community centers in every town in the most far-flung rural places you could find, where there are community centers for adults, where you have 70, 80, 90-year-olds coming in regularly to learn to read and write for the first time, because it's a systemic part of their education system. So I think this is a moment to think about the importance of adult education and how that gap, if we don't close it and we only depend on the dividends that are going to pay off 20 or 30 years from now with the kids who are in school now, can really perpetuate these cycles of inequity. And so a much more sustained investment in adult education is also really important right now. And finally, I want to close out with this topic that we spent, probably the most time talking about, which is the social emotional needs of our students and families. So I'm going to turn it over to Chanel and then to Colin.
Hey guys. So I think anyone who works in a school building understands the need and the importance of people who are school counselors, social workers, and school psychologists, and community programs that support our students. So working in Ward 7, I see our school is blessed that we have 2 counselors or mental health practitioners, but there are schools where there are literally hundreds of children being serviced by 1, maybe, mental health practitioner. And so for us at EmpowerEd, we think it's even more imperative now that we put a serious investment into our mental health workers, the people who can support our students with the socio-emotional piece, and also take some of that burden in supporting that teachers have to do in supporting kids there. I had a mom this week reach out to tell me that she's just feeling so overwhelmed, and she's mostly scared that when her child comes back, he won't be socially ready to be back in school. I also have students who are very concerned about, when do we go back? Do we ever go back? And dealing with a lot of those feelings. And they're 7 and 8 years old. So I think for us, it's imperative that we find and work towards funding more support for mental health practitioners, and making sure we're bringing in organizations. DC's full of organizations that can come into schools and support our kids, and that's what they do on a consistent basis, so we should be relying on them. And then thinking about our Spanish-speaking population that is ever growing, and making sure that we're not just having mental health practitioners, but Spanish-speaking mental health practitioners or bilingual mental health practitioners who can support all of our families across the board. And thinking about what changes can we make to the comprehensive staffing model that would allow us to have more of those jobs put in place, and more support for those students and families who are dealing with something that's very traumatic and something we've never dealt with before. And then I also think a lot about my students with special needs. So I'm a general education teacher, but my classroom has the largest percentage of students with special needs in our 3rd grade block. And so I'm receiving calls from their families about what supports can be done. There are students who are missing out on their occupational therapy services, their speech services, and how do we need to be considering, how do we make that up? How do we make sure that every kid has what they need and that what they're doing at home is meeting the goals that they have, but also supporting who they are as people.
Thanks, Chanel. Colin, do you want to add on about social emotional support for students?
Sure. So, so Liz has talked about this a little bit before, but I also teach pre-K. And one of the things that I've been noticing just in teaching my students, and I'm very fortunate that I'm able to check in with many of my parents at least once a week. One thing that a lot of my parents are concerned about, I think, is the trauma that even my current students are feeling just for being away for so long. Obviously, that some are saying, you know, like, oh, I want to be back in school. When can we come back to school? I've had other parents who mentioned to me that many of my kids live in the same neighborhood. When they see each other, like in the park or whatever, they don't even want to say hi to each other. And I think for me, especially as an early childhood educator, like basically our curriculum is bent upon relationships. And so in my mind, I'm just thinking about, you know, in terms of how am I going to help my little guys transition into kindergarten next year, especially since we may not have that closure that we might need, but how are we going to deal with new students who are coming in who've gone through different type of trauma. I don't know what school they're coming from. I don't know what their family situation is coming from, but having to deal with that as well. So I think, and I know especially in early childhood, like there's been somewhat of a push more into content. We really need to have that focus, especially, you know, at the beginning of the year and probably all year, to really focus on the social emotional development, especially for our little guys being able to communicate how they're feeling. Like, I feel sad, I feel happy, I feel confused, you know, helping them give that language, but helping them, you know, with steps as to how they can deal with their emotions appropriately, so that they're better able to cope in a situation like this where they may not have the language, especially for ELL learners, that they're able to at least clarify themselves as to what they need and how the adults in their lives can help them. So, so I think that, and I think there should be that focus within the district, just as far as PD, just as far as how as teachers we're able to help our students kind of cope with the possible trauma that they may have had, you know, in dealing with this pandemic. But moving forward, what steps that we can take, you know, especially in terms of a crisis, and God forbid if we have to do social distancing again, that they're in a position where they're best able to kind of communicate and then move forward as far as different things or different strategies that they can do in order to help them cope with the situation moving forward.
Thank you. And you know that part is really hard. And I as I said, I talk to my own little kids, and I'm just asking them questions like, do you miss your classmates? Do you miss school? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about not seeing them? And so just kind of checking in with folks emotionally, whether they're our littlest ones or whether they're our educators, is so important right now. And I want to get, we have so many incredible minds in this conversation, so I want to get to some of this feedback and questions. There's a lot more in the report, so please check it out and collaborate with us. And we had a question from Ms. Turner to Colin about, are you recommending summer and back to school supports in terms of social emotional well-being for our kids? And we did talk a little bit about what it might look like for us to focus the early part of the year on more social emotional support. So Colin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
So I actually had this conversation with my colleagues this week. And again, a lot of it depends on when we return to school. But one possibility that we did think about, and I think especially since as pre-K, we have a staggered start. So it could very well be that an idea that we approach is if we're starting early, maybe having like a week, maybe two, of having our current students and having that time with them as far as closure, and then having them transition to pre-K when we're introducing the new kids coming in. So that was just one idea that we've thrown out. I am at a school where we do home visits. I think those are important, but of course, given within the chat, we were talking about possible situations of, like families may not be wanting to have teachers come to their home, understandable. So one thing could probably do maybe a virtual home visit, or maybe meeting in the community. I think those have to be prioritized next year. But I think at the end of the day, we're not entirely sure. I think a lot of it depends on what the district says when we're able to return. But I think the biggest thing I'm thinking about is how can I give that closure to, my students, actually saying goodbye to them properly and having them move forward. And I think if I'm able to, in the summer, and I've been talking to families just as far as maybe like if these restrictions are lifted, maybe having like a small event at our school, at a park or something like that, just as a way to kind of have our students kind of be together, but also to, bridge that healing that they're going to need, especially as they move forward into the next year. So we have some ideas, but I think, again, a lot of it is kind of contingent upon when and how the district says that we should return.
Thanks, Colin. Irma wanted to chip in. Irma, are you there? Can you hear me, Irma?
Hold on, I see it. Okay, I muted myself. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Some of the things I've been looking into that I think would be very helpful is if we possibly start planning for a hybrid model, because like with hybriding, like all this flex scheduling and just the scattering, it definitely accommodates that. And then it also gives you more flexibility where if you do have to teach online, you can be more intentional about what you're providing and how you're doing it. And something else that I'm kind of running across is that just in terms of parent knowledge, like teaching parents how to use the platforms and these infrastructures that we're putting in place for them, I think it'll be very helpful if over the summer, I know, we'll probably all end up going back early, but maybe, that intentional time where we have to do planning or something like that, do like some parent institutes where it's like, this is our infrastructure that we're using. This is how you use it, because some parents can't learn from a video, or going back to the whole thing of access, like what does it look like so that they are able to use it. And then also seeing from the other side, because my children go to a private school, you have parents that have resource and access and don't know what to do with it. So again, just making sure that people are able to understand how to use it and what the expectations are for these infrastructures that we're starting to give them and are requiring them to use, I think is very important as well.
That's really important. Thank you. I wanted to see if, so there's a question about models from other places. One of the things is we're all kind of seeing, there's a lot of devastating news out there every day, but there's also a lot of inspiring things about things people are doing all over the place. I wanted to just throw that out generally and see if anybody had heard of models for some of the things we're talking about, especially social emotional supports and coming back to school from other places that you found inspiring and wanted to share.
Hi, everyone. This is Allison Kreiner Brown. I just came across, and I tweeted it out, there's an article, I don't know if y'all have seen from NPR, but Denmark and some of the European countries have started to reopen their schools, and they've outlined, there's a very good, solid article that had like 9 specific things that they've done, including much of what you all are already talking about as far as, like they put a limit on 12 students in the classroom. To talk about staggered schedules. They prioritize the younger kids coming back first, and the kind of some of the debate that they talked about around that was the need to really start with the daycares, pre-K up through kindergarten first, with prioritizing having them come in before the middle and high school, while also noting that those are the grades where the kids are least likely to be able to follow the hygiene needs that we'll have as far as hand washing and such. As well as, the middle and upper grades might. Another issue they raised, which will need to be a part of the demands, is making sure our schools are stocked with the kinds of cleaning supplies and materials that we needed, because as soon as they started, I think it was after Walls shut down to do the deep clean, and then the mayor made the promise that schools would be doing a deeper clean, I had staff at my daughter's school and at several other schools being like, we're already understaffed for our custodians as it is. Where are these magical supplies going to come from? My business manager doesn't know where this is going to come from. So A couple other things, but yeah, there's at least a good NPR article out there. Scott, I'll send it to you if you haven't seen it yet, so you can share out with others that, yeah, there are places where schools are reopening, so there are lessons that can be drawn already. One of them that is being said is that there is no, completely safe way to reopen schools until there is a vaccine. So I think that what you have outlined as far as like teachers not being punished, for having to use up all their sick leave if they get sick, like that has to be a part of the platform. So I'll send it to Scott and you can share that out.
I think I just found it, Allison, from your Twitter and posted it in the chat there. And anybody else want to comment on things that they've seen from other places? We've had some links posted here. Anybody want to elaborate? So, does someone want to jump in? I was going to ask LaJoy if you are open to it, to just, you'd seen some comments about social emotional support for students, and especially for our special needs students, if there's anything you wanted to contribute that stood out to you on what else we can do there.
Hey everyone, can y'all hear me okay? Okay, you probably hear Bria in the background. She's on my lap, so if you see her there she is. I think like one of the biggest things, just from a parent standpoint, is we're just gonna have to have a collaborative relationship.
I got something to say to you.
Can you let me finish? Is that cool?
I got something to say to you.
I know you got something to say, but it's my turn. Wait a second.
I got something to say to you.
Would you like to say hi so I can finish? Say hi. You have to go on the camera. Say hi, everyone, so I can finish. We're on a time limit. Say hi. You have to get up. Look, get up. Say hi. Say hi. As you hold your whipped cream. Good job.
Hi.
Yeah, we're gonna have hot chocolate soon. That's our treat for our movie. But just with the social emotional, parents are. Go get mommy's iPad. Here, go get the iPad. Here, actually, here, take mommy's phone. Bye. Here, you can have the phone. Ow, Bria. Here, watch Ryan. And that's sad when you have to use technology to get your child to do something. But a lot of, especially families that have children with disabilities, we're going to have to really meet parents where they are, because parents are experiencing so many different things. And I think it's important for our special needs students that we have some type of distance learning plan created, because there's no real way to implement an IEP right now. And emotionally, that IEP is just really overwhelming for one or two parents to implement. Like, it's just not, there's no physical way to implement the IEP, right? And so that's just like really emotionally draining. So if parents are like, I can only do 30 minutes right now, then let's do that. You know what I mean? Like, let's focus on quality versus quantity right now, and maybe come up with like a distance learning plan. And I think tag with Ryan. And I think, like as we talk about recovery, I think we're all gonna have to really dig. We're all gonna have to really dig, into IDEA, and we may have to look into somebody help me out. Not waivers. Comp Ed. Comp Ed. And so I think that's a conversation that, that we're all gonna have to look into, because socially and emotionally right now, it's just draining for a lot of us parents. So
yeah,
y'all keep me in your prayers.
And as a final thought before we go to some closing thoughts, Grace, are you here? Grace, who are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts to add on the digital divide and model elsewhere in terms of prior to be doing.
A lot of the sort of solutions and things we're doing right now are short term. If we do not take this chance to come up with a sustainable plan for providing technology access, we'll have missed this opportunity. So, for example, we're providing laptops and hotspots now. When those break, we'll be back in the same boat. So what we need to do is figure out what is the technology infrastructure and system supports we need to support both in-school and distance learning. So I think what we're trying to do is wanting to make sure that we're not just doing a Band-Aid approach. Like we're thinking as a city, how should we fund and maintain and refresh our technology? How should we make sure teachers get the professional development they need to do this, educational technology and online learning? And so my group is working on what I hope will be like a 2-pager kind of with our recommendations. But I think the main issue is let's just not do a Band-Aid approach. And also let's make the city look into what are the options for expanding internet access. There's a lot of discussion right now, like, hey, maybe we should pay Comcast a few million for their internet essentials and just cover some families. And it's like, 10 years ago, we had federal funding and the city actually came up with some options for broadening internet. Like, how about we go dig up those old proposals, come up with new ones, and look at what is the menu of options for broadening internet. And so I've seen a lot of talk, but I haven't seen that analysis of what's the menu of options for our city being done.
Thank you. And I want to close with just two choices, which is, first of all, thank you to everybody who contributed to this, all the educators and everybody for being part of the conversation. I did put in my email in the chat there so people can send in comments. And when we see kind of consensus around a lot of things coming in, we're going to keep adding them to the report. I want to talk about two choices that we have. When we really illustrate, right, the inequities that already exist through a crisis like this, I think there's a tendency to you kind of see two clearly outlined paths. One is we're going to really reduce, right? Think about how we can cut back. This is a difficult time. We're going to have to cut budgets. We're going to have to make hard choices. And then there's big thinkers, right? And there's people out there saying, this is exactly the time when we need to invest in the people who need the most investment, and we need to support those who need the most support. And the way that happens is by making sure that the people who really need the support are the voices that are involved in making the decisions about how big we need to go and in what ways we need to invest in people. And so there's two choices, I think. One is, are the people who are going to inform the conversations going to be the people involved in the conversations? Our students, our teachers, our parents are going to be, and our frontline workers, right? Are those going to be the people who are informing our decisions? And so that's why we have this effort to make sure those in policy and elected officials are really listening to those who are practitioners to make sure we get this right. And then the other choice is, once we have that voice informed, right, are we going to accept that we can go back to systems that were not working before? Or are we going to say this is actually an opportunity to really transform education in so many ways that we've talked about? We've been asking for social, emotional, and trauma-informed support for a long time for more counselors. We've been talking about the need for more special education providers and for bilingual counselors. We've been talking about the need for more English language learner support. We've been talking about the digital divide. We've been talking about the need for adult education. So there are a lot of things here. We've been talking about the need to focus on academics and individualized instruction instead of spending 2 months out of the year on testing. We've been talking about the need to reduce teacher turnover. So there's a lot in here, as Liz said at the beginning, that's not new, right? There's a lot in here that these are the things we've been saying for a long time. But this is exactly the moment when we have to make those investments, because if we don't make them now, we're deepening the inequities exponentially, because we know so many families are going to be in a state of crisis. And so if we don't invest in birth to 3 and make sure we have excellent childcare, if we don't invest in the digital divide, if we don't invest in mental health supports, we're going to be in a far worse position than we imagined we might have been, a year from now, 5 years from now. But if we take this opportunity and say, we're actually going to, one of the recommendations is, let's ask the people who really can contribute to contribute more. Let's ask people who are wealthy to contribute more in taxes, because it's just charity, right, to get us through this. But let's make sure that the people who can contribute can do that, and that we use that money to stimulate the people who really need the support the most, which are our frontline workers, our students, our teachers, our parents, and make sure their voices are ever present in these conversations. So that's what we need your help to do, to elevate teacher voices, elevate student voices, which are tragically have been out of this conversation when it comes to education, and to make sure that the policymakers are paying attention to them in these conversations. So this Education and Child Care Committee for reopening is happening now. They have a deadline of only about a week from now to turn in recommendations. So if you know some of the folks on that committee, Kathy Riley from SHAPE, Ebony Rose Thompson from the Ward 7 Education Council, the president of Trinity University. There's a lot of other great folks on that group. These are people who are, listening to our ideas and trying to take them back to that group. Make sure they hear our ideas and that they can be a voice for those in that committee. But they're only going to establish these broad parameters about if we reopen, how we reopen, who goes back, in what order. And if you have thoughts on that, send them along. But the next thing is we need all the stakeholders like you to determine what the details are, how this is really going to look, and how we do it in a way that supports everyone who needs the support the most. So stay engaged with us. Send emails if you have ideas about how to improve the plan. And then please look at the end of the plan where we have a long list of the elected officials, staffers, etc., who are making these decisions. Send them emails and communication. Let them know we need to listen to educators. We need to listen to students and parents, and listen to our principals and help everybody come up with ideas so we can come out of this in a stronger position than we imagined and transform education. Not just to recover it, but really to revive it and create something new in its place. So thank you guys so much for being on here. We're going to put this on YouTube when it's done. And please, another action you can take is share this out. And so other people who weren't able to be here can hear these voices, and we can have a better plan for getting back to a new normal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. You all have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
How do I close? Do I hit close?